Good evening, everyone. I am Peter Carmichael. I am the director of the Civil War Institute, and I welcome you all to Fighting Words, the polarization of American politics and the American Civil War. Before I introduce my fellow panelists, just two quick notes. First, we encourage you to use speaker view on Zoom, and you are muted. You can't unmute yourself, but you can ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. In fact, you should ask questions as we are having our conversation this evening. And one of my colleagues, Jill Titus, she will be forwarding those questions to me. So again, please ask away and ask while we're having our conversation, and we will certainly try to answer. So the image that you see before you, is it up there, Jill?
Yep, it is.
There it is. That image from January the 6th of the assault on the Capitol. I just want to say that this moment, that incident, that's not an aberration in American history. A lot of folks considered it to be exceptional, unusual. In fact, even a noted historian from Harvard, to be redundant there, Jill Lepore said to NPR that what had occurred at the Capitol, she said that that was off the grid of the trajectory of American history. So I just want to say, for those who believe that this was unique, that it was exceptional. For those who believe that, I think this really points to a failure of our education system and also a failure of the media to properly educate people. Now that image, again, it is so shocking, so disturbing to see that the banner of treason is at the center of power of this country. To see that that banner of slavery, again, being carried in a very rebellious manner, that conjures up ideas and thoughts about the Confederacy, conjures up thoughts about the Civil War. And it's only, I think, natural for all of us to start to make parallels to that great conflict. And we will certainly this evening think about the Civil War past and think about how that past connects and relates to politics today. But I'm not going to speak for my panelists here, and I think that I can say very confidently that none of us here believes that the past repeats itself. None of us here believes that we're on the brink of secession. None of us here is losing sleep at night thinking that a civil war is looming. But all of us here do believe this. We do believe that in studying the past that we can conceptualize the present more clearly, that we can often take into account elements of the present that we might overlook, and that we can also then look to the future more capaciously because of our understanding of the past. We are all very suspicious of people who use the past to find easy answers to the present. And so what we're going to do today is that we are going to look at a few aspects of Civil War history that have been invoked by pundits, historians. We're going to talk about their use and maybe even their misuse of the past, and use that again as a way to think more critically, more deeply, and what we all, I can say again, I'll speak for all of us, what we all love is what we're trained to do, and that is context. We love context. We love context about the past, and we believe very strongly that the more context that you can bring to the present is going to result in a more sophisticated and more satisfying analysis of the world around us. So let us begin first by introducing our panelists. I'm going to begin to my immediate left, Professor Michael Birkner, a graduate of Gettysburg College, did his PhD at the University of Virginia. He is, I would describe it as a political historian, an emphasis in the 20th century. However, he has written extensively on 19th century politics, especially the presidency of James Buchanan. To the left of Professor Birkner is Dr. Ashley Luskey. She received her PhD from West Virginia University. While she was completing her PhD, she was also a park interpreter or park ranger at Richmond National Battlefield Park on the front lines of history. She is the assistant director of the Civil War Institute, where she works with our CWI fellows. These are students. She is just doing outstanding work with them because of the magic of Zoom. She has had sessions with our fellows, or our students, with a range of practitioners in our field, from preservationists to someone from the Library of Congress to other public historians. Our students here at Gettysburg College, they get fantastic training in the classroom, but because of good work of people like Ashley Luskey and Jill Titus, who is also here right now, they are always finding ways to getting our students connected to that professional network of historians. And finally, on my far left is Jim Downs. Jim Downs, it is his first year here at Gettysburg College. And let me say, it is a victory for our students here. He is extremely dynamic and engaging professor in the classroom, and he is also a noted scholar. Many of you, I hope, are familiar with his first book, Sick from Freedom, and it gives you, I think, a very different take or angle on the story of emancipation. He has a new book that is coming out in the fall, and Jim, I'm sorry that I don't know the title off the top of my head, and that title is?
It just changed, so it's fine. Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, War, and Slavery Changed Medicine.
So Jim is a 19th century historian, Civil War era, but his specialty is emancipation, and particularly issues related to health and science and medicine as well. So it is, again, a real addition to have Jim here at Gettysburg College. All right, with that, we will get started. And again, we will reference the photograph that is behind us, the photograph of the protester in the halls of the Capitol with the Confederate banner. And so many people have looked at that photograph, and from that photograph, they have reached the conclusion that white supremacy, of course, is alive and well, and it is white supremacy that is what animated those protesters at the Capitol. Now, we are not going to comment on that directly, at least not yet, but we know that many have looked back to the Civil War past, and they see, of course, a continuity between those white Southerners who filled the ranks of Confederate armies, who followed that banner, and the eyes of many, they followed that banner for the cause of white supremacy. So my question to the panelists, the first question, is the use of this Confederate banner as representative or an expression of white supremacy, how effective is that in helping us understand the motivation and the makeup of those white Southerners who fought in rebel armies? And again, there's no need to raise hands here, my friends. You just need to just speak up.
Can I start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah,
So first, I just wanted to thank the provost and the president for encouraging us to have this conversation in the first place in the wake of what's happened. One of the things that I'm thinking about, just as a sort of prefatory note, is just the very organization of us coming together to respond to the present. And as a historian, I spent a lot of time and have written a lot about the ways in which historians oftentimes turn to the past in order to help make the present legible, but that, of course, was not my own invention. That's something that changed within scholarship, I would say, in the mid to late 20th century with American studies scholars who believed in the idea of a usable past. So I just want to provide this sort of context to say that there was a larger social transformation within the academy in the 70s and 80s that actually pushed historians to, and literary scholars and others within the academy to start thinking about how their work has a direct application to the present. And so on one level, it's totally exciting to sort of say, wow, it's the Civil War, and how can we sort of think about how the Civil War responds to this moment. But one of the things I want to think about is to sort of say, is it actually the Civil War, is it the best moment to frame this, or are we actually talking about a cultural war? Because in many respects, it seems to me, and this is what Professor Carmichael has sort of raised, is this the flag of the Confederacy. how much of this is designed to evoke the Confederacy? How much is it designed to evoke white supremacy? And how is that part of a larger conversation initiated by Trump and others that's part of a kind of culture war? Because what I see happening is that the Confederacy and representations of the Confederacy become a banner to encapsulate many ideas. On January 6th, it was in response to the election. At other times, if you go back into the early days of Trump's presidency, this image was evoked to talk about the border wall. We talked about immigration, talk about Hillary Clinton, talk about vaccination. So again, we're not really seeing is a hardening of a line between regions or even an ideological split, but we're seeing pop-up issues that are getting sort of circulated throughout the culture, and the flag here is becoming a way to try to stitch together these various ideas that don't really have, I think, a hold in any particular moment, but are part of a larger sort of cultural problem and a cultural debate about what is the meaning of the United States.
So, and I'm going to turn to Ashley real quickly about this very issue. So, Jim, I think what you pointed out here is a way for us to think about the past, because that banner during the Civil War period has come to be understood as just a statement for white solidarity and white supremacy. And what you're suggesting to us and what is that banner has meant many different things, even in just these last 4 years with the Trump administration. So Ashley, when we think about the Confederate banner during the war years, how should we think about it? How should we think about the makeup of the Confederate rank and file?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the flag that you all see on the screen is the battle flag of the Confederacy. So it's a flag that was taken into combat to, rally troops, to keep men together. It's a signifier for martial purposes. It's not the national flag. Now, that doesn't mean that it's divorced at all from the politics of the Confederacy. But it's important to put that out there, is that there were a series of flags the Confederacy did use, and this was the battle flag rendition of it. But in terms of when we're thinking of the lineup, the rank and file of Confederate armies, I think that it's important to look at the variance, what ties these people together, as well as what divides them, what made them different. Men who fought under this flag, they fought because they were part of a slaveholding society. Only about a quarter or so of that population in the South actually owned slaves, of course. And so a lot of people always say, well, how come so many people went to war supposedly to fight for slavery if they didn't own slaves? And it's always the question that I got while working for the National Park Service, a question that I get also from students these days, though not quite as much as I would anticipate. And we have to realize there are binding threads here that brought these men together. And while white supremacy was certainly one of those, and slavery is very much a part of that, I think we have to unpack exactly what that meant to the men who were in the ranks. So for those poor Southerners, for instance, who were fighting, under this banner, under this regime of, mass slaveholders, the 75% or so who didn't own slaves, they were intimately bound up with a slavery society. They benefited from it. They could hire slaves out. Chances are they had an extended family member, a friend, or a neighbor that they could rely on, the use of a slave even for a day's worth of labor every now and then. Certainly, even if they didn't own slaves at the time, they aspired that they could become slaveholders. And so that was always in the back of their minds as something to kind of aspire to. But then there's also the dignity of labor, of white labor, that the system of slavery represented, that these people were fighting for. And that's kind of contrary to the northern idea of the mudsill class, that there's a kind of a white poorer class, largely immigrant for the most part, who's going to take care of the menial labor. But in the South, white Southerners knew that as long as there was slavery around, they would never be the lowest rung of the social ladder, and that they would never have to perform that menial labor. So there's a social component, there's the dignity of work component, there's a class component, and of course there's the strong racial component as well. Slavery, of course, kept African Americans in chains. It kept them from hopefully, this was the idea, at least amongst white Southerners, that we now know was not correct, amalgamating with white women. We know, of course, that happened frequently, and it was largely white slaveholders that were responsible for instigating that with Black female slaves. But as long as slaves were in chains, then it would prevent the, pernicious, quote unquote, intermixing of the races. And so this was an attempt to keep, white blood pure. So there's a lot going on for those men who are fighting together under this banner. There's race, there's social class, there's a dignity of labor, but there's a lot more than just merely, white supremacy as a banner.
I want Paul Michael in here, and you can pass on this question if you like. And I think what Ashley has done so well for us is to talk about these important reasons that a non-slaveholder would have given his life for the Confederate cause, and that we see that white solidarity and race is certainly crucial to this, but that's not all that's at stake. And one, I guess, could maybe then sort of broadly describe the Confederate movement as reactionary populism, as one could describe some of the followers, not all, but some of the followers of Donald Trump. And so with your understandings of political history in the United States, again, we're not trying to say history repeats itself, but we're seeing through these parallels that it brings to our attention issues of today. Is there something that we can find in expressions of reactionary populism? I think Ashley, again, has done a nice job of giving us a good understanding, a deep understanding of what was foundational to that. And do you see that in other times, at other moments in American history? And if you want, you can comment on some elements of Trump supporters today.
Well, thanks, Pete. You've given me a wide berth here, and I appreciate it. Now, let me take one thing you said and play with it a little bit. Talking about history not exactly repeating itself, but of course, remember Mark Twain observed that history may not repeat itself, but it can surely rhyme. And I think that there's something serious embedded in that comment, because I think based on what Jim said, based on what Ashley said, Jim, I take cultural understandings is very critically important to making sense of the issues we're talking about. With Ashley, we're talking about mindsets. These are things that as historians, we have to plumb. And in our job is to do it, not in a reductionist way, but to do it in a way where we see that there are differences, there are nuances, there are things that are contradictory in some respects. So then the question is, once you can't just do that, because then you lose your audience. So then what you have to do is you have to step back from the contradictions and step back from the nuances and say, okay, what is usable here that is accessible and worthwhile in advancing the conversation? In terms of your giving me, an opportunity to say something about the question you raised, I think that we have both continuities and discontinuities in terms of issues having to do with race and having to do with consensus versus conflict in our society, in terms of mindsets about the opposition. My special interest in modern American history is the Eisenhower era, which was an era where consensus was much more common than conflict. So you can't say that we've always been exactly the same in the way that we treat these issues. For me, I think there are resonances, and this is where I think we can, all three of us, chime in on this. I think there are resonances between the mindsets of the people who would fight for the Confederacy and the people who carry that flag today, the people who are very committed to a Trumpian worldview, whether or not they went into the Capitol or not. And I think that there is a sense in both cases. Let me just put this out, and then I'll stop for the moment. I think there's a sense in both cases that you're either losing something, have lost something, or will lose something if the political alignment tilts away from you. And I think that you can see this very clearly in the comments of many Trump supporters, that they're losing the America that they think matters, the America that they think should be regnant, and they're losing it to people who they don't think should have it. And I think some of that existed in the response to the election of 1860. I'll stop there.
That actually leads very much into a question that has been posed.
Please go, Joe. Yeah.
We take your point that the parallels are tenuous at best. So the question is not what this flag meant to Confederate soldiers, but what does it mean to this fellow in the image? My guess is that he doesn't know one thing or another about Confederate soldiers.
Good comment.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll say that Jim said that's irrelevant, right? I mean,
Yeah.
right, he doesn't know the history of the Confederate flag is kind of a sidebar issue. It's what does it mean to him today? So Jim, what were we gonna say about that?
So yeah, so I just need to organize. Okay, so first, let me just say this. In response to what Michael said, everything he said, I think, is 100% right, and it's on target. One of the things I could say is, as a professor, is I have students coming to class talking about the Civil War. What caused the Civil War? White supremacy. It's too simplistic. What do you mean white supremacy? You're just throwing something out there. I need to know what's actually happening on the ground. What does it mean that white soldiers, because this is what Ashley said. She said a lot, so I just want to unpack what she said. It's not just that we have to think about, it's not just white poor people feel better than black people. We have to think about what's materially on the ground in the South before the Civil War. And what's materially on the ground before the Civil War is a population of people we never talk about, free black people. There are free black populations in Charleston and Savannah and Louisiana throughout the South. There are white people that are competing against a free black population during this period. The white master class cajoles the white poor class, the yeomanry, into believing that they're like them, and that this is aspirational, that you could emulate me, you could sort of think like me, the master class, and be like me. And this becomes the subject for so many historians, because at this time, people are thinking about Marx, and they're thinking about Gramsci, and these are all political theories that are sort of circulating throughout the academy in the 70s and 80s. And everyone's trying to understand what it means. And all of a sudden, in order to apply these theories, they go to the South and they say, look, this poor class that's competing against other poor black people that are actually at their same socioeconomic level believe in this discourse and ideology of white supremacy. And that's why they become pro-slavery. It's connected to what materially is on the ground, the same economic status, the same housing, the same lives, the same culture, but they're seduced into believing that they have something in common with the wealthy white people, even though their life might resemble more of what's happening to free blacks. So there's that materiality there that's actually supporting a white supremacy discourse. The second thing is,
can I just jump in real quick?
go,
Just
go.
a little tension with this. You use the word cajole and seducing. Jim, I'd say you're right. They were competing to some extent, with some free blacks. But I think what's overlooked here is that their aspirations were being realized in a material way, and that the access to land was crucial to that dream. And of course, ultimately the ownership of enslaved people. And although that number was going down just a little bit before the war, they still looked to the territories to live out what was their American dream. It's horrifying to us to think that the American dream is not kind of the post-war Horatio Alger story. But I think what is striking to me is that when we speak about one element, and we need to be careful here about the Trump supporters and not homogenize them as one. But there's one element of the Trump supporters, and it's usually those who are carrying the Confederate flags, and they look to many of us as to be very sort of working class. It is shocking to me that they are just described as racist and white supremacists, but where do these people live? Your point is spot on, man. Where do these people live? What about their jobs? Are they feeling, and I think Michael already sort of alluded to this, right? Are they feeling threatened? And I think that they actually are in a real material, tangible way, Michael, in a real way. So I'm sorry to jump in.
No, it's right. It's not white supremacy out of a kind of Darwinian notion of civilization, a hierarchy. It's white supremacy grounded in the material reality of this sort of socioeconomic kind of competition. Now, let me just say something about the flag. And Ashley did a much better job, knows much more about the different types of Confederate flags. But I'll just say this, the creation of the flag and the creation of what we can call Confederate nationalism, we in the present look in the past and we say, well, that's a homogenized, monolithic, firm idea. Like people in the Confederacy all rallied around this idea, and people really excited about it, and people were having parades as men were enlisting, and the notion of Confederate nationalism was very much entrenched in Southern society. But if you look at a very thin book, it's an excellent book called Confederate Nationalism by Drew Faust, what you begin to sort of see is the effort to create the flag is a response to a crisis of people who are not ideologically united. In fact, there's an effort by the newspapers at this time to have poetry contests to get people all behind this notion of something called the South. There's a contest to talk a certain way, the actual dialect of what is the correct way of speaking as a Southerner. They don't want to sound like Black people. They don't want to sound like Yankees. They really emphasize this Southern dialect. There's even the Jefferson Davis's wife decides to, as one of my students just brought up in a presentation, this comes out of the Faust book, to take clips of soldiers' hair and to create a hair monument. So when we, in 2021, look back, we see this Confederate flag and this nationalism as something that's permanent, that's fixed, that's impenetrable, that's impervious. But it wasn't at the time. It was actually, there was debates about that, and they had not yet created this unified theme. In fact, you can look at women's historians will say the same thing. Women are storming the streets and having bread riots. So when we think about the Confederacy, when we invoke it today, we must recognize the conflict and the consternation that actually tore apart at the seams of the Confederacy. And we can't put forward this myth that the Confederacy was more unified than it was. Our memory of it, the lost cause, erects these statues, creates this memory of this unified entity. But in real time, during the war, they're struggling to create a kind of identity and to create a nation.
So Jim, I'm going to turn to Ashley and then to Michael about this. Again, this is what we're trying to do. We're going to unpack the history here. Ashley, so Jim's pointing out that there's divisions amongst white society, that Confederates had to be made, and that's a big part of Drew Faust's book, Creation of Confederate Nationalism. So I'm just, an average dude reading about Confederate nationalism and thinking, how the hell does that matter? What does that matter to what's going on with these politics? Why does it matter that I need to know that there were divisions, dissension in the white South? Why does it matter?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think your point about the divisiveness, the variance within that population, it is so important that Confederates, especially, of the leading classes, they knew, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not, they knew that, they always had to keep a certain finger on the pulse of what was going on from down below and things like the bread riots. And issues you have, obviously slave revolts or rumors of slave revolts. They always know that they're walking a tenuous line and that they have to keep their supporters or kind of the rank and file, they got to keep them in line. So that's that power play. They know about that, and that's always central. I think it's also important for us to consider, there are these divisions, class divisions within the Confederacy. There are, of course, pockets of unionism throughout much of the South, in North Carolina, certainly in parts of Virginia as well, and even into the deep South, we find pockets of unionism in Tennessee, where the political ideology just doesn't, reach everyone, and people are actively fighting against it. But I think the important thing to remember is that when we think about Confederate supporters, the Confederate nation, and then we think about so-called Trump nation, there are divisions even within so-called Trump nation, that not everyone is this guy right here with the Confederate battle flag. He doesn't stand for everyone, that there are people from all different classes who lined up and put, their vote down for Trump, 74 million, Americans, that there are people from different races even who came to vote for Trump for different reasons. And so those people bring to the table their own baggage, whether it's political, whether it's a class issue or a work issue, whether it's, the culture wars or feeling, personally offended by some of the things going on the left, and they feel threatened because of, accusations being hurled at them. I think we have to keep that in mind, is that these people were not monolithic. There are divisions, there are tensions, and even with what went on with the riot, I think that there's a lot of Trump supporters or former Trump supporters who say, this is heinous, this isn't us. We never thought it would come to this. We don't support this kind of thing. So that variance, that division, that tension within these movements, whether it's the Confederacy or Trump Nation, I think is important to keep.
I think very well said. This should, what Jim and Ashley have said, should awaken us to the complexity of not just the followers of Donald Trump, but of all people. The Voldia Glimp came and spoke to our students, and someone asked, this was shortly after Trump was elected, and she said, I can't offer you an overriding generalization about Trump supporters, but she said, I can say that a Trump supporter in Michigan is probably different from a Trump supporter in Alabama. And so we have, I'll just not bring that to Michael. Do you have any sort of frustration that you feel in terms of how Trump supporters are being portrayed by the media or by other pundits? And do you feel that in any way could be sharper if there's maybe a greater understanding of the past?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I accept your premise. I think that both Jim and Ashley laid out important points, helping us to get underneath overgeneralizations and oversimplistic assertions. Let me give you a take on this, though, because I think there is a glue that holds both the Confederates or the would-be Confederates in the late 1850s and early 1860s and Trump supporters together. And that is something that a historian named Lee Benson reminded me of many, many years ago. It's called negative reference grouping, and how powerful that is in terms of pulling together people who might have different, as you said, interests, different education, different status in life, different mindsets about certain things, but they have a commonality. And I certainly, as someone who does follow politics closely, could see a real common denominator among Trump voters that is aside from this issue of the flag, that is aside from the issue directly of race. Because I think we're going to get a briar patch if we try to say what percentage of Trump voters are, overtly racist, whatever that even consists of. But there are key words that emerge in the 1850s when you have Southerners talking about the Yankees, and you have key words when you talk to Trump voters about what it is that makes them vote for Trump. And to me, one of the most interesting, quick comments that was made about Trump by a Trump voter that I found fascinating, which is relevant to this, is a woman who was asked why she was voting for Trump, and she says, "I know he has my back." And I'm thinking, that's got all kinds of things in it, because he's going to protect her against whatever forces that are malign and going after her worldview, her way of life, her own stability in life. Trump people have an image fed by the conservative media, and we can get into that, it's one of the things I'm interested in, that gives them a hook in terms of understanding why voting for a Democrat would not be acceptable, even if Trump does mock disabled people, even if Trump uses, epithets to describe certain political opponents, even if Trump makes 30,000 misstatements or false statements, that they still have a reason to back him. So we can look at this from the top end, or we can look at this from the bottom end. I think it's our job to sort it out as historians, and that's what Jim and Ashley are trying to help us to do. But I want to come back to a point that may be controversial, and that is, I think there is a hell of a lot of resonance between the mentalities of the pre-Civil War era and the mentalities today that exist in politics. There are differences too, but we as historians need to face those similarities head on.
Before we get to that excellent observation, I know Jill has another question.
We have two, actually, both related to the flag. One is more of a statement that I would be interested in your response to. The purpose of the Confederate flag, in this picture, was not as a symbol of white supremacy, but as a symbol of division from the left. The stars and bars is not a symbol of white supremacy and should not be taught as such. It was derived as an alternative for the American flag at the time.
So I'll be honest with you, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole on this. I mean, I think this speaks to what Jim was saying before, that this flag has come to mean very different things to different people throughout time. And to suggest that this flag has no association with white racism or white solidarity is an utter denial of that history. And at the same time, I do see why some people, especially, I saw it growing up, who would use that Confederate flag, didn't know the first thing about the Civil War, and they saw it more as an expression of working man independence. So to get back to Jim's point, yes, that flag has taken on very different meanings at very different times. We have to be very, again, context, right? We've got to think about context and place. And I would just recommend to this person to read John Koski's book on the Confederate flag. And I think that that could sort of answer some of the questions, which again, I respect, I understand why some people could potentially reach this conclusion. It's one that I don't see it.
Can I,
Yeah. Jim,
can I just respond? I mean, I don't, how do I say this? I don't think there are, when we talk about how we remember the Civil War, part of the problem with the statue crisis, the monument crisis, is that it was elite white people in power that got to decide what statues sat outside their city halls and what statues and commemorations were in their parks. Once we allow post-civil rights movement, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, you allow Black people to get involved in the conversation, all of a sudden it's clear, these statues are racist, there's a debate against it. I'm not sure there's many African Americans who would not see this as racist. So I think it's like a kind of an interesting sort of moment that from the vantage point of a lot of white people, they could say, well, it has this history, it means this, it means that. For Black people, that flag is racist. And that's the point. I mean, I grew up watching Dukes of Hazzard. I saw the Confederate flag on top of the General Lee car. I didn't think of it as racist, but it does mean something to Black people, and it does mean that it's racist. So to argue, and then the Dukes of Hazzard is no longer allowed to play on TNT. The point is, we have to understand that there's a movement of Black people happening in this country that's trying to awaken a large part of the population to understand what these various symbols that might seem innocuous, that might seem benign, that might not seem to matter to white people, actually matter to Black people. And so what the history of the flag is, I don't really, we could say that's for another day. To many Black people, this is a representation of racism. And there's a great video, it was on YouTube, where a Black guy sees the Confederate flag on the back of a truck, and he runs up to the truck in the middle of the highway and pulls it off. That's telling you they're not thinking about, well, the origin is X, Y, and Z. So when we're saying all Black Lives Matter, it's about what's happening right now in terms of the George Floyd trial, but it's also about sort of saying, let's step outside of ourselves and let's think about what this might mean to the rest of the population, because they might not see it in this kind of nuance.
But Jim, you get, I think, to where the rub is, because I'm curious, what would your response be to somebody who said, these Confederate monuments, many of them when they were first installed,
right?
These were monuments of mourning and loss. Mm-hmm. And so what do you say to someone who is a descendant of a Confederate soldier who says, I respect that a person of color or a person who's not of color, and says that this monument and this flag is nothing but a racist monument, but says, how can we have a middle ground that I can still have a history as I understand it, as I appreciate it? How do you work that out?
Well, first of all, we have to ask the question of when and where are we talking about? These are not, the monument question needs to be located in specific time and place. So there's a difference. So there's a difference between. So I guess I was saying, there's a difference between putting a monument in front of the city hall and putting a monument in a cemetery.
Okay, so I'm gonna say, well, let's say Loudoun County, Virginia, and Leesburg, right in the middle of town. That is a monument that was put up like so many others to commemorate the services of those Confederates of that county. Right. And they're of course descendants of the soldiers of that county who live there to this day. Right. So I don't have an easy answer here, but I'm trying to figure out how can you have a shared commemorative space in which people can say that's vile, right, and racist, and stood for slavery, and still because someone else to say, hey, how can I still use that space and think of it in a different way?
Okay, so because the question is this: when the decision was made to put that particular statue there, who was in the room? Who had the power? And when was it made? And so my argument is if you have an open democracy where Black people actually could vote, where Black people could serve on city council, where Black people would participate in the urban landscape, and Black people decide that they want to have a monument that supports a white soldier memory, that's fine. But oftentimes, these are decisions that were made at the height of Jim Crow, they're made in public spaces, and they mean different things at different places. I mean, so my sense is I don't ever want to say, this is my rule on monuments. I would say it depends on the monument, it depends on the place. It's a difference between putting it in a municipal place versus putting it in a park. And it depends on, are Black people disenfranchised at the moment when these decisions were made? Because a lot of times they were.
So let's shift to what I think the three of you said so nicely about the average Confederate soldier, and I think Michael's points about the motivations of Trump supporters, and he was very careful to identify that we cannot lump them under just one category. And I think that the conclusion that I got from what you all said is that we need to be careful when we speak of individuals being duped or misled. And I think we hear that a lot. I know we hear it a lot, not just about the past, but we hear it about, particularly about Trump supporters. So I think that's a fascinating, again, observation. I'd like to sort of build upon that and think about the political crisis of the 1850s, leading to secession and ultimately to the war. One of the theories, explanations of the coming of the war was the blundering generation of politicians, politicians who were to some degree inept, politicians who relied upon fiery rhetoric to animate their constituencies, politicians at the end of the day were not capable of dealing with the issues so that it could ultimately lead to compromise, and we could have avoided secession and the war. This blundering generation, again, is to some degree an indictment of democracy, and to some degree it's also, I think, an indictment of the people, right? That they were hoodwinked to some degree. So let's talk a little bit about the political crisis of the 1850s, how we should think about the coming of the war, and then talk about, again, the polarization about politics today. So who would like to give us?
Well, I mean, I'll start with it. I think you framed it very, very well. And I think just for the folks who are not into the historiography, let's just remember that the notion of the blundering generation is founded on the notion that the Civil War was not inevitable, that it was a, quote, repressible conflict. The people who pushed this forward were not themselves necessarily racist. They were people who had been impacted by the First World War and who felt like this is something we cannot do again. We've got to get politicians to figure out how we're going to avoid war again. And then they found an easy mark in the weaker politicians of the 1850s, or the people who were simply extremists, the Louis Wigfalls of the world. But you know, you've got presidents like Fillmore and Pierce and Buchanan who are not in the top tier, and then it becomes an easy thing to say, well, if they'd been wiser, this whole unpleasantness could have been avoided. Now, by the time I became more interested in history, and it's a long time ago, that was not where historians were anymore, because the Eric Foners of the world and the Eugene Genoveses of the world and others began to remind us that there were serious differences. And if the war was not inevitable until it happened, there were good reasons why we were going to have a war, whether we had Buchanan as president or Fremont as president. So I think that the blundering generation is a simplistic and overwrought interpretation of the 1850s. To me, and I think to connect this to more recent scholarship, each of us is familiar with the work of Joanne Freeman of Yale. And one of the things that her work brings, to the forefront is the degree to which imprecations, extreme language, even fisticuffs and worse in Congress was a common, if not necessarily absolutely normal phenomenon. I mean, you have a situation where a senator from Mississippi actually pulls a gun on another senator who had a different point of view. He happened to be from Missouri, and that senator pulls his shirt open and says, fire on me, you bastard. And they have to go and separate them. And when, of course, you have the Sumner Brooks incident and all the rest. I think that it's important for us as historians to recognize that we aren't quite there yet. But you know what? We better be careful, where we're going and what we find is tolerable and acceptable in the discourse that we have in our country. And that will, I'll just very briefly say, that leads me to make the statement, which is hardly original with me, that, you know, the tribalism that we now increasingly have in our country, which in some ways is resonant with the tribalism of the 1850s, derives from a modern media environment that encourages people to stay in their own camps and take their news as it suits their ideologies, and to avoid anything that doesn't fit whatever narrative they want to believe in. And that has a lot to do with the emergence of the shock jocks on radio, most notably Limbaugh, of course, but also the rise of Fox News, the response of the liberal side to sort of be an alternative to Fox News, and then people choosing their truths. And that's a complicated story too, because I don't want to get into a situation, and I won't, of suggesting that what one side is doing in terms of blocking out facts is exactly the same as what the other side is doing about blocking out facts. And I do think you could then play with that and take it back to the 1850s and say something similar.
Well, yeah, certainly I think there's a general failure on the part of the media on both sides. And maybe one side's more culpable than the other, but we're not served well by that. I want to take two things out and then go to Ashley, and then we'll work our way down to
And then we have some other questions.
we have some other questions. So I think that the one thing that Michael, you have expressed so well is this growing belief, at least at the time, that the people who were in leadership positions were not serving Americans very well. And you've been suggesting that we should find threads or mentalities that you believe at least sort of persevered over time. There's some degree of continuity. You know, the cynicism that pervades this country, right and left, about the people who are at the helm, whether it be at local, state, or national levels, is truly astonishing to me. So I think, again, you find a parallel there. Then your next point, which is a good one, the press and how they function and their role in shaping these perceptions. And so I'd like for Ashley to talk first. Let's keep it to the war, because the other thing that you said at the end, Michael, I hope Ashley will address this. You said, "Now wait a minute. We've had historians, including Jim's advisor, Eric Foner, and Eugene Genovese, who have helped us to say, hey, wait a minute here. There's a lot of froth that's being generated by all this back and forth and a lot of crazy accusations, but underneath that froth, there's some real issues." So Ashley, could you speak again to what's really at stake here in terms of the coming of the war? And then could you talk about these perceptions? Were they false? Were they exaggerated in the 1850s? And how, again, that might help us think about today?
Sure. So I guess I would start off by saying, first of all, that Michael's emphasis on the power of emotions and emotional rhetoric during the 1850s, that's huge. And Michael Woods wrote an excellent book about this, the power of emotions in terms of the debates swirling during the antebellum years, and how certain words, certain touch phrases, certain key words, whether it's liberty, whether it's slavery, to mean myriad things, whether it's Black slavery or slavery to to the man, the federal government, whatever it might be, touchstones of the rhetoric of honor. Those were real, and those were what helped precipitate fights. They could be considered fighting words in Congress. And I think we see this still the same thing today, that there are certain touch words that are used by either side, trigger words that are just loaded. And if you say them, then you're going to get a certain response from your own side and from the other side.
Actually, underneath your point about these triggering these strong emotions in the 1850s, are there real issues underneath that at all?
Sure, and absolutely. And that's the thing, is that these emotions become, they definitely originate. There's always a grain of salt, or maybe more than a grain of salt, behind them, but they always originate from something truthful and something real. The notion of honor, for instance, that Southerners would say, well, our honor is going to be stripped away from ourselves, our sense of masculinity, our patriarchal society, that's going to be stripped away from us if we lose slavery, if we bow down to the so-called Black Republicans. Those were charged words, but they also knew that there was a lot at stake. That without slavery, the South, it can't function as they know it. It completely upends the social order. unless, so-called slavery is, reinstituted with, very strict Jim Crow laws and such. But they know that the social order, the economics, the cultural foundations which keep a society together, that's really, at stake, and that's really, being threatened. If the North is able to abolish slavery, or even, end the expansion into the Western territories, because eventually slavery is going to eat up all the available land in the South. And then, the system will, people fear, die out. So that there is something at play there. But I think that the emotional rhetoric, it gets to attacks on personal character, and it gets kind of more intimate in terms of, this class of people, this group of people, this individual, this politician, they're evil, they're somehow hateful, instead of actually drilling down into what are the real issues and motivations that have caused that individual to speak or believe something. And I think that's where Michael's point about the press, both in the 1850s and today, it can be pernicious in that regard. Because, even the term Black Republicans, that wasn't an accurate assumption or an accurate term. All Republicans certainly didn't believe in, Black equality, and all Republicans certainly didn't believe in abolition. But that was a word that was used to fearmonger and promote fear and unify, Southerners against the North. And, we see that today still. You throw out the term such and such is racist. You say that term and immediately people have to recoil because they don't want to be called racist. And that shuts down certain debate about certain topics instead of drilling down into, well, why do these people who are so-called, racist feel the way that they do? Are there really legitimate issues driving them? Whether it's about skin color, whether it's about social class, whether it's economics, whether it's about law and order. But the hyperbole, the exaggeration, the emotionally charged rhetoric, it comes from a real place. There is something behind it, but it does a real disservice because it obscures more than it reveals about the material issues at play and the real, legitimate ideas and points of view that people are bringing to the table.
Before I get to Jim here, again, I think bringing this together, we can see again that our democratic system, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is one where civility actually has rarely ever been practiced. And so I'm always struck by people today thinking, if we somehow can just come together and be respectful, that will make our democracy work in a way that is more functional. And certainly it's not going to help hurt if people were a little bit more polite and a little bit more respectful. And now I'm going to turn that to Jim. Jim, is this emphasis now on civility that we just need to find a way to get along now? And when we look at the past and we see, hell, our democratic system, people have never gotten along. Man, it's a rough and tumble business. Can you help us understand, is today the blundering generation with lots of rhetoric and there's not real differences between the right and the left and they just sort of misperceive each other? Because we got real political economy differences in the 1850s, and Ashley's just pointed out to that, right? There's some real stuff at stake here. What do you think about today and about this, the divide, the polarization of American politics?
I don't know. No idea. I would say a couple of things. I would say, look, on one level, I'm trained to think about the past, so I'm not a political scientist, so I don't want to go too deep into the present because I mean, there are colleagues who work in psychology and people who work in sociology that I think could sort of unpack this. I would say a couple of different things in response to what Ashley said. Okay, so if we say that people recoil when they're being called racist, they recoil the argument, what is the bottom line of that? Like, what's actually at stake in saying something that gets that sort of label put on them? I don't know if that's really our job. I would say that there's actually a larger history of the fact that people haven't been able to call out racism directly. I mean, I guess I would say as a historian, it was very common to lynch people 100 years ago. I mean, it just happened. We're not that far away from lynching. So if right now the negative thing is you're called a racist and people, I mean, so what? I mean, like, there's more racism embedded within American culture than this, that we have to actually engage, and as historians, we have to actually point out. And so I'm not necessarily thinking it's my responsibility as a historian to say, what is the motivation for someone to understand why they were made a statement, and is there a socioeconomic basis for their statement? I think that my job as a historian is to say, listen, we can just do this genealogically. I mean, maybe that's the easiest way. It wasn't that long ago that many people who were born in the 1970s or 1960s could very easily trace back to their grandparents' slavery. Slavery was not that long ago. So if I'm in a class and I start talking to my students and I say, it's 2021 and slavery ended in 1865, they're like, 1865? I mean, you could say 1905, it seems like so long ago. But if I say to you, in 1975, in Gettysburg, if there were Black students in your class, they could probably know that their grandparents were enslaved. Slavery then seems like it's not that long ago. So I guess I would just kind of push back to say, we have to frame this cultural war that gets constantly repackaged as a civil war and say that we're not that far past the history of slavery and racism.
So Jim, all I would say to that though is,
Yeah.
you want to continue to frame everything as a cultural war, and I understand and believe
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
importance of that. But what you continue, I think, to overlook is that there is, as you said at the very beginning, a material world in which these people exist. It doesn't matter to somebody who is poor, and I don't care what color they are, about the history.
Right, 100%.
History, I'm just saying, let me make this point. When there is working people who make claims that they feel that they are disadvantaged, it is not an explanation to say to them, well, you get white privilege. White privilege is like the mudsill argument. It is denying people the ability to see their commonalities, not cultural commonalities, but commonalities of people who are living on the margins, who are Black, white, all their skin colors. And it is striking and somewhat disappointing to me that on the left and the right, they have successfully managed, because they're both beholden to dark money. Let's get real here about this cultural stuff. Let's talk about where the money is, because that's what really matters. And so these working people on all sides, of all colors and of all backgrounds, they have successfully been pushed to other sides. But you know what? There is hope. And here's the hope, that we saw more Black people and people of color vote Republican. And why do I think that's hopeful? Because it's getting people out of what Michael said earlier, out of their little pods. Because the identity politics that's played on both sides is utterly destructive to democracy. And so that would
I get that, but Pete, but here's my point. Our position on this stage is as historians. The expertise that we bring is as historians. So my point is, I feel comfortable when I do bring the conversation back to history, because that's where my expertise is. I mean, yes, I understand what you're saying about the present, and I can talk about the present, we can talk about the present, but I'm not invited here to talk about the present. I'm invited to talk about the past. And so that's what I'm saying.
Well,
like,
I will speak for all of us. We give you complete freedom to speak about the
But
president.
see, I think that's where I get uncomfortable, because I would say my expertise as a historian is to frame it according to what happened and to remind people to say, slavery is not that long ago. These issues are not that long ago. Now, what people say about white privilege, what people say about racism, what the roots are, that's why we have a sociology department. That's why we have Africana studies. That's why we have these other disciplines that can actually engage that. My point is to say, how can I frame this historically, which was your initial point. I mean,
But I think even there, when you do that, you miss the opportunity to contextualize the present by saying, well, because this existed in the past and it was racist, then it automatically means that it's racist in the present. But it ignores the present day context of what else can be contributing to that conversation, that just because something happened in the past due to a racist motivation doesn't mean that because it happens again today, it's only because of racism. And I guess that's where we as historians, I wish we'd be a little bit more humble in that regard, that yes, we're historians, we study the past. But that doesn't mean that we can say, well, here's something that happened today and it can always be explained by something that happens in the past. We have to look at the multiple contexts of the present.
Michael, do you want to jump in here? Because then we have some questions, so go right ahead.
No, I mean, I agree with what Ashley said. I think that the two things you said a few minutes ago, having to do with there being something underneath the symbolic language that people use. And it'd be very easy if I could take the time to talk about what I think is involved in, say, a Trump voter's mind. And it isn't necessarily directed to race. It has to do with the discomfort with diversity in this country. It has to do with attitudes about the role of the federal government in this country, and other issues as well, having to do with, I used to make $16 an hour working at a particular plant in Indiana, and now I'm making $9 an hour working at a 7-Eleven. And that has something to do with framing a person's attitude about the present political situation. But I also agree with your other premise, and I'll let it stop right now because I know you want to.
We have some questions here. Again, I'll just say, I don't think it's no shock that the major networks on both sides do not talk about political economy because they're both beholden to the money of global capitalism. And so we don't have that. And again, Jim, I know.
Well, they're beholden to ratings.
Ratings, which is money, which of course is advertising. I mean, it comes back to that. Jill has some questions for us.
Yes. So here's one from a Gettysburg history alum. The symbolism of the Confederate flag often shows up in the context of the delegitimization of the federal government, not least in the context of the war itself and January 6th. Do you see a tension with the intense nationalism the Capitol attackers expressed? In other words, we have the same symbol used in the disruption of the constitutional process, this time carried by people claiming rather than disclaiming support for the US Constitution.
I can give a real quick answer to that. And we can go back to the Civil War past and we can see that the very people who supported secession, who waved those first Confederate flags, they made the claim that their assertion of Confederate nationalism was actually a purification of American nationalism that had been perverted by Northerners. So you can see even today where we see the contradiction where they claim they're great patriots, but they're flying this flag. They're saying, oh, wait a minute, this flag, how we see it, how we use it, we're the true Americans. You see that back in the Civil War. More questions?
Yes. A number of writers, including historians, have drawn a close comparison between the early evolution of the lost cause and the big lie regarding the recent election. Is this a fair comparison? Did we lose anything in reducing the early lost cause to a unified attempt on the part of white Southerners to lie about the recent past as a way to make sense about the present?
Well, one difference would seem to me to be that there are a lot of people who are deluded today about what the facts are. I mean, what is it? 65% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. That isn't really a lie on most of their parts. They actually think that the election was in some way or another rigged. That's where the democracy today is in the biggest trouble, because unless we can agree on some certain commonalities of factuality to then disagree about, then where are we? Because we can't talk to each other. What do you say to somebody who looks you in the eye and says, no, Trump won the election? And that, of course, has something to do with what happened in January the 6th. Though I don't think those people were liars. I think they were, in their own minds, patriots. And I don't have any doubt of their sincerity. But if you're working on a premise that is absolutely factually incorrect, then we have trouble.
I think that there's, again, there are things that can be said that that's an accurate statement with the lost cause. There are, echoes of that with the so-called Trumpian lost cause, and there are things that maybe diverge a little bit. I think that, a part of the issue, the central part of the lost cause rests on the notion that the cause was lost not because of anything that was done by Confederates themselves or Confederate generals, but that it was damage done to them by the enemy, by technology, by overwhelming numbers. And I think, again, we see that with some Trump voters who say, Trump did everything right. There was no way that, this election could have been lost, because, the policy was there, the action was there, the politics were there, without being able to come to terms with Trump's many weaknesses and his flaws. That always thinking that it came from the outside instead of acknowledging how Trump, contributed to his own downfall. I think this premise is on stronger ground or higher ground. I think, again, the writers who make these strong connections about the lost cause is the same as the Trump lost cause in that it's so rooted in white supremacy. Again, I think that that's ignores a lot, that obscures a lot. It's not just white supremacy that the lost cause was rooted in. Certainly that played a big part of it, but it's not the only thing. And again, today, it's not the only thing that unites Trump supporters, even people who say, yeah, today, you know, if he ran again, I'd vote for him. It's not necessarily white supremacy that's uniting those people. And I think that that's obscuring. And then when we look back at the lost cause, it's obscuring to say that it was only about white supremacy. I'm definitely saying that's a key part of it, but it's not the only thing that explains that movement.
Yes. What about comparisons between the January 6th and insurrection and other militarized uprisings or rebellions in American history? I mean, not the Civil War, but others.
Jim, thoughts?
Other militarized uprisings besides this. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's the shock of this, and I think the elephant in the room with this image is that, what is it, 400,000 Union soldiers died to prevent this from ever from preventing to ever have a Confederate flag flown in the Capitol building. So there is it's really an aberration. But I would say we would have to look at what was, and I don't have the encyclopedic knowledge of attacks on sort of federal buildings or on federal government buildings like this. I mean, there's other kind of pop-up rebellions, but nothing like this in that respect.
Jim, I'll draw from something that you
Yeah.
said earlier, and I think that, again, it reminds me of that as Americans, unfortunately, our sense of history goes back, maybe 2 weeks or a month, right? It just doesn't go back far enough because there are countless examples of violence committed against the state,
Right.
not just the federal level, but at state level,
Right.
before the Civil War, as well as after the Civil War. And it is, again, distressing to me that our lack of knowledge leads us to have a very detached view of our historical realities. And because of that, I feel like that we have then an overly optimistic or idealistic view of what politics should be. So that when we encounter the rough and tumble of a democracy, we sort of throw up our hands and say, look, it's a failure, and it's a failure because of them, meaning the politicians. They're always to blame. And so when one loses faith in their government, and I believe that, of course, people should have a healthy skepticism of their government, but we then, I think, lose sight of what's realistic and what can be accomplished. We live in a partisan system, my friends. This is democracy. It's not republicanism. And I think that the one thing from what happened, not just in the wake of Biden's election, but of the last 4 years, in many instances, what happened in the Trump administration were attacks on democracy that I certainly had never seen in my life. But I was ready. I sort of held my own, not because I think the Republican experiment is just going to prevail because God has ordained it. That's just foolishness. But I believe that it prevailed because I ultimately have faith in the people. And there are so many examples throughout history in which people have faced and confronted violence. And Jim's specialty, and we'll get back to your history. And when I was in college, I didn't study Reconstruction. It was just too damn depressing. And there's so many dark, horrible, just horrific things. But reading Eric Foner's book, Nothing But Freedom, I mean, his Reconstruction book is great, don't get me wrong. But Nothing But Freedom changed it for me, right? There's a moment, and that moment was seized. And it was seized by Black folks and by white Republicans. And yes, that moment, it did not realize its full potential, but as Foner reminds us, that there is no historical event in which the causes of that event are nicely resolved at the end and we can all declare victory. It is an ongoing struggle. And when we accept and understand that ongoing struggle, I think that we can begin, buck up and work our way through these difficult times.
I want to make one quick comment on some of what you said, Pete. You said a lot that was meaty and worth chewing on. We're running out of time. I want to get back to the point you made that we're not necessarily, as a republic, falling into despair and and essentially degradation. This week in the New York Times, there was an article by a conservative columnist by the name of Ross Douthat, interesting writer. And he was comparing his watching a popular television series called Babylon Berlin. Some of you listening to this program with us tonight may be familiar with it. It's about Weimar Germany, and it encompasses a lot of stuff going on. And after talking about the different ways in which he sees parallels between Weimar Germany in terms of the dark money, the conservatives who are pushing the media to essentially support a right-wing coup, the decadence in certain parts of society, the police being corrupt, these kinds of things. He then makes a point. He says, he said, I was thinking about this, and he says, before I pushed it too far, I realized what happened on January 6th. Did the insurrection prevail? Did the country fall apart? Did we accept the idea that these insurrectionists were on the right side? And he says, of course not. He said, the republic stands. And he said, this doesn't mean as we shouldn't be aware of these historical parallels, but we shouldn't despair about where we are. And I think that that's very relevant to the conversation that you've led us through tonight, Pete.
Jeff, did you have some final remarks here?
Well, again, just as a historian, I would say, you brought up this question of the Foner book, Beyond Freedom, and or Nothing But Freedom. One of the things he says is just, it's the end of the Civil War. And the question is, how do you rebuild, how do you reconstruct this new society? And in order to do that, he compares what's happening in the post-war South to Africa, to what's happening in Jamaica, to different places. And he says, you know what? Because of capitalism, there's this desire to always have a dependent lower class. There's a dependent lower class in the post-war South. There's a dependent lower class in the wake of emancipation in the British Caribbean. There's a dependent class in Africa. And then the question is, what becomes the organizing principle or the force to maintain a dependent class? And that's when white supremacy sort of emerges as the force to keep Black people in a subordinate position. And that same practice can be seen in the British Caribbean and Africa. So I hope tonight what I have tried to sort of say, and I think we can argue about different things, we can talk about different things. I'm happy to talk about a lot of things. I write for the press all the time, but I'm always trying to say, what can I bring to this conversation as a historian? And what I can say is that white supremacy is not just a concept that just comes out of thin air that says, oh, I think I'm better than you, or I think this group is better than you based on the color of their skin. It gets deployed and reinscribed in moments, as Dr. Carmichael says, in the service of a kind of political economy, which is basically just a fancy way of saying in the service of labor and capital that's designed to keep a society functioning. So that if, in fact, to answer Michael's question, the Republic stands, what is the fuel that's keeping the Republic to stand? It's that capitalism hasn't died in the wake of January 6th, and that we still have the need to have a dependent class doing work, performing kind of labor, and that white supremacy emerges at a particular moment in time in order to maintain that class order, class structure. And so I think that's always something to think about, is that it changes over time and it has a particular function. And as historians, we enter these conversations and we can be excited and we can be animated, and we're living in this world. We have lots to say, and we have lots to think about. But we also have to think about, what can we say that sociologists can't say? And what can sociologists say that we can't say? And I actually, surprisingly, despite being an interdisciplinary and starting out my comments saying something about American studies, I'm still kind of purist when it comes to disciplinary boundaries in terms of what I feel trained to do in a public space like this or in a classroom.
I think we could do it all.
Well, okay.
No, I mean, we could do a lot. I think we
Okay,
could do a lot.
okay.
And, Ashley, did you want to have some final comments here?
Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate, I like Michael's point about, the Republic still stands, that despite the horrific things that happened on the 6th, that they're not still happening today. They didn't happen in the weeks after, that, yeah, we're still here. And, Biden was sworn into office and here we are, we're chugging along. And I think that gets to this idea of American exceptionalism, which again, Pete, you kind of spoke to in terms of your belief that, yeah, we can always be, there are always going to be forces knocking at the door, whether it's tyranny or anarchy or any other number of pernicious forces that could threaten the democratic republic that, we have, that we live in. But a belief in the fundamental, I guess, goodness, the success of our people, the workings of our system, how it's been laid out. I think that's key. And in acknowledging that you can still believe that, America is great, America is exceptional, that somehow we'll prevail, we'll get through this, even though we always have to be aware that there are these forces knocking at the door that could very well threaten us if we, aren't careful about it. But that you can be all of those things, exceptional, great, enduring, with many flaws as well. And I think a lot of people on the right or the left have this belief that it's got to be pure, that America is evil, either evil and has everything wrong, there's nothing to be proud of, or America is perfect, we've corrected all of the wrongs of the past, there are no echoes of the past in our present day society. And I think when those two sides try to come together for a conversation, that's what feeds into this tribalism, that's what feeds into, again, the identity politics and these pernicious forces that tear people apart. You can believe in the goodness of America, the system, the American people, the belief that somehow will prevail if we keep working hard and, being aware of those forces knocking at the door, even while acknowledging that the system is not pure, that we're not pure, we're not perfect as a country. There are flaws in the system that need to be worked on. But acknowledging that and having that humility while also having that pride, I think is what brings people together and can help to overcome some of those tribal boundaries.
What's missing from our current conversation relates to a very good point that Ashley's just been making that relates to certain kind of openness and humility. And I always tell my students, I think that one of the premier things that they can come away with as liberally educated kids is a comment that a great judge named Learned Hand once made in a speech to graduates. He said, the spirit of democracy is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. And that sounds odd in the first hearing, but if you stand back from it, it forces you to listen to the other guy and find ways in which, all right, there are real differences, but where do we find some similarities? Where do we find some middle ground? And I think your comments, Ashley, point exactly in that direction. So, I mean, I'm going to be a despairing optimist about all of this.
Well, we'll end on that semi-optimistic note. And let me first again thank our panelists, Jim, Ashley, and Michael, and also point out to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the Eisenhower Institute. I think this is at least the first time since I've been here for almost a decade, that we have joined forces to come together with this panel. And I want to thank the audience for sticking with us. We're about 15 minutes over time, and appreciate your questions and encourage you. You can find all of us, of course, on the Gettysburg homepage, and send us an email if you want to have other questions or other conversations you'd like to carry on. And I think, again, what we need to spread the word here is you got 4 academics, and we're not in lockstep at all in terms of our opinions. And that certainly defies the common perception out there that we are, all of our kids come to socialist boot camp and we send them on their merry way. That doesn't really happen, at least not here at Gettysburg College. And so it's, again, been a pleasure and an honor to be able to spend this frigid April 1st. Man, that's no joke, is it, man? It is cold out there tonight in Gettysburg. And we are looking forward to having you all come back to campus, whether it's reunion weekend, CWI, summer conference, not this year. Sorry, big build up for that. But we'll be back. We'll be back. And so we thank Jill Titus and Heather Miller for helping us get all the logistics here. And you all have a wonderful night. Stay safe and healthy and happy in the coming year. Thanks so much, you all.